Over the past couple of years, I've been developing my sound, and I've done that with a real focus on making sure that every single song that I put out is just full of emotion. And one of the main ways that I do that is with chords and melodies. So in this video, we're going to take a look at some of the previous chords and melodies that I've written in my tracks, break down how I wrote them, what they actually are, and the structure of them. So hopefully at the end of this video, we can write our own chord progression that gives the same sense of emotion that you could then develop into a full track. So let's jump into FL Studio and get to it. The first song that we're going to take a look at here is a song I released last year called Do You Feel the Same? This is a slow, sleepy, lo-fi beat that is just packed with emotion throughout. Core fundamental part of the song that really drives that home is the piano chords. So let's break them down. Now, if you haven't heard this song already, this is how the chords sound. When you first look at these chords, they might feel slightly complicated, slightly disjointed, and if you're new to this, maybe you don't have any music theory knowledge, you might not even know where to start. So let's break down what these chords are and how you might build similar chords to this. So the first chord in the sequence here is actually a C major. If I bump this F up into the kind of main section of the chord, you can see that we've got almost a C major triad here, but instead of using the third note, which would be the E, I'm using the fourth note, which would be the F. So we've got the C, which is our one note, D, which is our two, E is our three note, which is what you'd normally use in a C major triad, and I've bumped that up into an F. Now what this does, it turns the chord from a C major into a C suspended 4 chord, because instead of using the 3, which is what would make it the major, I'm using the F, which is the 4, which makes it a C suspended 4 chord, because we're using the fourth note in the scale. I've then used the G, which is the 5, which is what you'd expect in a C major chord, and then I've doubled the octave on the C. So we get this C suspended 4 chord. From there, I've taken the F, dropped it down an octave just to expand that chord. We get a bit more kind of depth and flavor from the chord. So if I push it back into a C major chord, which is how I would have started, this is how it would sound. It's still nice, but it's a little too bright and happy for what I was going for. So if I push that E up to an F, we're suspending the chord. It's sounding nice. It's got like a little bit of tension when you suspend a chord, especially as the first chord in a song. And then if we push that down an octave, this is how the chord sounds in the actual song. And I've then mirrored that here by using the C, F, C, so just 3 of those notes, but in this time I haven't inverted the F, so I've got the C, F, C playing again here, just as a little filler chord, and then I've resolved the tension with the use of the E note here before moving into the next chord, where I've used that E note again, so we're kind of using that to bridge the gap into our next chord, which is essentially an A minor 7 chord. So let's listen to how that sounds. Now I know this doesn't look like a typical A minor 7 chord, but that's only because I've moved one note. So here we've got the A, which is our 1, and then in an A minor you'd see the C, which would be our 3 note, and then into the E, which is our 5 note, and then the G, which is our 7 note. So a typical A minor 7 would look like this, but because I've used that C in these previous chords, I bumped it up, and this just kind of helps the chords flow seamlessly into each other, and that flows nicely into our final chord in the whole song, which is this G major chord. And now this is just a standard G major chord. The only difference, again, I've moved one note. So here we've got a G major triad, G, B, and D, 1, 3, and 5 of our chord. It sounds a little bit like squished, and I've inverted the chord by pushing the B up an octave. I've also carried the C over from our other chords. It just kind of adds this little bit of like tension and suspense to the chord because we've got those 2 notes that are right next to each other. but it just sounds so, so lovely. In the second half, I've got that same C major chord. I've played a slightly different C here. I think this is actually an F major, F, A, C, and then I've inverted that C down an octave because it sits really nicely with the previous chord. And then playing those same two chords again. It looks more complicated than it is. If you build your chords using what you do know, build your chords using just a triad. You know, if you know how to make a major 7 chord or a major 9, build those chords and then just start playing around with inversions and suspending your chords, and you can end up with something that feels a lot more emotional, a lot more gripping to a listener than just a standard triad. It also feels a little bit more interesting, and it's a really great way of kind of just making those chords feel a little bit more. Now, this song actually doesn't have a ton of melodies that come in until quite late in the track. So the song builds and builds, and then the first melody that I get here is this guitar melody. And all I'm doing with this guitar melody is focusing in on some of those notes that build tension and focusing in on some of those notes that release tension. So we're moving honestly only between, I think, 3 or 4 notes in this whole guitar sequence. Yeah, in that whole section, there was only 3 notes. I think I'm starting on the 5 of the scale, which is a G, moving up to an A, and then up to a B, and just kind of moving between those 3 notes. I know that they all sound really nice because they also fit within the chords that the piano is playing. So if you look at the piano chord progression here, we've got a G, an A, and a B throughout the progression. So there's a G here and here, as well as an A. Then in this one, we've got a G and a B. So I know that I'm fairly safe to sit and play those and around those notes. And I know that as long as I keep coming back to those notes, the guitar is going to feel safe and comfortable within the track. So let's take a look at another one of my tracks now and see how I built the chords in that track. This is actually an unreleased track that I'm still sort of working on and tweaking, but I think it's getting there. And I chose this one because it's got a piano melody that we can break down as well as our piano chords. This song is in an A major scale, and we just look at the chords here. We've got essentially a 4 chord pattern that's happening. So let's take a listen to how these chords sound, and then we're going to break them down again. A little bit brighter than the last song, and honestly quite a lot simpler. So we're starting with this chord here, which looks almost like it might be a C sharp chord, but it's not. This is actually just a really simple A major chord. A, C sharp, E. It's the first chord in our scale. We're kind of starting the song on our home chord. All I've done is take the C sharp and the E that sit within the normal A major triad, and I've dropped them down an octave and also doubled up on that C sharp. That's what gives it a lot of body. So doubling up on that makes it feel really nice and really full. The next chord is even simpler. This is a D major chord with a doubling of the D octave. Then move back into our A major chord, but this time we're playing a different inversion of it, leaving the E in its place to add that higher octave. Again, really simple chord here, an F sharp minor. So because these chords are so simple, let's take a look at the scale and figure out how we're moving between chords within the scale. We're starting this chord sequence on the root note of the scale. That's the A, so we're going to start there. Then we're moving up to the 4, moving up to the D, and then from there, moving down to the 3. From there, we're moving back to our root note, going down to the 1, and then finally jumping all the way up to the F sharp, up to the 6. So it's essentially a 1-4-1-6 pattern. So that was a nice simple one. I will say the only other things I've done with these chords, which I do with all of my chords to make them sound a little bit more interesting, is adding a strum and also tweaking the velocities of each chord to make sure it has a unique human feeling to it, because obviously these were written in MIDI, which can sound really stale and robotic if you don't mess around with them a little bit. So now let's move on to the melody in this track. Let's check out how it sounds with just the melody and the piano playing together. So let's take a look at what I've actually done. And to help us here, I'm going to drop in that scale again. So the very first note you hear is that D. And as we know, that's the fourth note in the scale. It's not a note that we hear in the first chord. So it's going to build a little bit of tension, because what we do here is this C sharp here. When we hear that D, it builds that tension because we've got two notes playing that are right next to each other. But it also helps it sort of stand out a little bit. We then resolve that tension by moving at the end of this section back to an E. One of the sort of home notes to this scale, so it's always going to sound nice pretty much with any chord that we're playing. A few continuous motifs throughout, so we've got this D C sharp that plays on the same beat, every beat throughout the melody, so it kind of feels familiar. There again, using that E and that A, which is our root note, to kind of ground you back into the melody. Without that, it might just sound a little bit too busy or a little bit too tense. Yeah, it just feels like it's not resolving, but by moving back to that A, we're moving back to the root note of our scale. It's good to have these sort of notes in the bank that you know that you can kind of get back to resolve a little bit of tension. And then the final part of this melody, we have this kind of build up here and then bring it back down to our root note, the last note of the melody, the root note of the scale. But what you will notice is that build, we have this G, a D here, so it's kind of mirroring that part that you've heard consistently. And then giving you a nice break, a nice bit of space after that A. Now let's take what we've learned and try and build a new piano chord progression that has the same sense of emotion as the other two that we've already broken down. So the first thing that I'm going to do is try and find a chord, one single chord that I like the sound of. We can then choose what scale to go from and pick our chords from the scale. So I'm just going to jump into an empty project and let's try and find a chord. Let's start with this D sharp. We'll make it one bar to start with, but I'll tweak that as we go. So let's build a D sharp major triad. And on its own, it's quite bland. Double up the octave on that D sharp. It adds a bit of brightness, but it's still just a little bit stale. So let's try what I've done in that first song and suspend the chord. So I'm going to grab this G, which is our 3 note, and move it up or down to try and find a 2 or a 4. That sounds a little bit too gloomy for me. Try the F. Just bump it up. Okay, see, that's sounding nice. That's got the vibe that I kind of want to go for here. So now we've got that chord, let's choose a scale. And the way that I like to do this is to grab the stamp in FL Studio, choose the major scale. I write most of my songs in the major scale. And what we can do is move it up and down like this till we find all of the notes. So we could use C sharp major scale. We could use the D sharp major scale, the F sharp major scale, or the G sharp. So we've got quite a lot of choice, but I like this chord. Let's bring it back down and use the D sharp major scale. But what we can now do is use this to choose the next chords in our sequence, because what we now have is the root notes for every chord in this scale. In that second song, we went 1, 4, 1, 6. So let's try the 4 of this scale, which would be the G sharp, which is the note that we've already used here. So I'm going to grab that. I'm going to try and stick within this D sharp being the highest note that we're using. So what else have we got? So that's a little bit too bright, but perhaps we could invert this by dropping the C down. Maybe we'll just, okay, now I don't really love that. So let's go back to our triad and let's try suspending a second chord. So what we've now got is a G sharp suspended 2 chord. And I'm going to take that A, drop it down an octave. Let's see how that sounds. I'm not loving that chord. Let's scrap that. Let's try something else. Maybe we could try the 6, which would be the C. So we go C, D sharp, G. That's going to be our triad. Let's chuck that higher D sharp in there. Move that so that it sits next to the G. So I'm still not sure on that C chord, so I scrapped it. Let's find something else. Okay, now let's figure out what chord this is. So here we've got a C major 7. So inverted the D sharp, which would be the 3 of our chord, up to match the D sharp in our original chord. I'm just going to drop the velocities of these to make them a little softer. And after that C, I feel like I need to like resolve this a little bit by bringing it up a little bit higher. So maybe this is the time to move to our G chord. And the difficulty with that G chord is that it's using all the same notes essentially up here as our C chord. Perhaps we don't use the G and we try an F, which would be an F minor chord. So we're kind of following this downwards pattern here, and that changes the chord kind of entirely. It changes it from a G minor chord into a D sharp suspended 2 chord, but the F and the A down an octave. So this would be like the triad for that chord. And then if we drop those down an octave to make them fit, you get this really lovely sounding chord, and then we can use that A sharp down there as well. It kind of feels like that's where the sequence wants to resolve. So I'm going to grab that chord and extend it out for the rest of these 4 bars. We've used our A sharp down there, so let's try pushing this one down to match that. From there, I'm going to select all of these. We're going to do a little bit of randomizing on the velocities. So let's bring them down, and then let's add a strum to make these really feel super, super nice. And then I'm going to go in and just tweak that strum ever so slightly. And just like that, we've got a really lovely chord progression that we can build upon to start our next song. And I really hope that you can take what we've learned in this video to help you structure your own emotional sounding chords. And if you want to see how I use chords like this to write songs of my own, click on the video on the screen right now and you can watch me make a whole track from scratch.